The gavel was one strike away from destroying everything Marcus Whitfield had spent 30 years building, and the only person standing between him and prison was the little girl he had once found shivering behind a gas station dumpster, except now she was 28 years old, wearing a navy blue blazer, and holding up 2 pieces of paper that were about to turn a courtroom full of powerful men into stone. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that the family you choose can matter more than the family you're born into, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching this from, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that kindness always finds its way back to you, and subscribe to Oxley Stories so you never miss a story like this one again. Now let's go back to where it all began. 15 years earlier, on a rain-soaked November night in a small industrial town called Millhaven, Marcus Whitfield was not yet the man whose name would appear on shipping containers across 4 continents. He was a 34-year-old widower who owned a modest freight logistics company with 12 trucks and 18 employees, and he was driving home late from a warehouse audit when his headlights caught something moving behind the dumpster at the edge of a closed gas station. He almost drove past it. Almost. But something in him, maybe the ghost of his late wife, maybe simple human decency, made him pull over. What he found was a girl, no older than 13, soaked to the bone, arms wrapped around her knees, lips a shade of blue that no child's lips should ever be. She flinched when he approached, the way a person flinches when they've learned that adults reaching toward them rarely mean help. He didn't grab her. He didn't call the police first. He crouched down in the mud in his work clothes and simply asked her name. It took nearly 10 minutes before she whispered it, Josephine. Just Josephine, no last name she was willing to share, because the last name she'd been born with belonged to a father who had put her out on the street after her mother died of an overdose, unable or unwilling to care for a child who reminded him too much of the wife he'd lost. Marcus drove her to the hospital that night, not the police station. He sat in a plastic chair for 6 hours while doctors checked her for hypothermia and malnutrition, and when a tired social worker finally arrived to ask what would happen next, Marcus surprised everyone in the room, including himself, by saying that he wanted to be considered as a foster placement. He had a spare bedroom. He had a steady income. He had, above all, a promise he'd made to himself in that hospital hallway that no child would spend another night behind a dumpster if he had anything to say about it. The foster system moved slowly, as it always does, but Marcus was patient in a way that surprised his own family. His sister Renata thought he was making a mistake, taking in a traumatized stranger when he was still grieving his wife and raising no children of his own. His business partner, a sharp-tongued man named Desmond Cole, warned him that a scared, wounded child could bring chaos into a life that was just beginning to stabilize. But Marcus had seen something in Josephine's eyes that night in the rain, not just fear, but a fierce, quiet intelligence, the kind that survives by watching everything and trusting nothing. He wanted to be the first person who gave her a reason to trust again. The early months were not easy, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Josephine barely spoke. She hoarded food in her room, stuffing crackers and bread into the corners of her closet because some deep, animal part of her brain refused to believe that meals would keep coming. She flinched at raised voices, even when they weren't directed at her. She ran away twice in the first year, once making it as far as the bus station before a kind ticket clerk recognized her from a missing persons flyer Marcus had printed himself. Each time she ran, Marcus never punished her. He simply picked her up, brought her home, and told her the same thing: this house isn't going anywhere, and neither am I. It was during the second year that something began to shift. Marcus noticed that Josephine had taken to sitting at the kitchen table while he did paperwork for the freight company, watching him sort invoices and shipping manifests with an attention most teenagers reserve for their phones. One evening, she pointed out an error in his fuel cost calculations that had been quietly bleeding money from 3 different routes for months. Marcus stared at the number, then at her, stunned. She shrugged and said she'd just been looking at the patterns. That was the night Marcus began teaching her, not because he expected her to become anything in particular, but because he recognized in her the same hunger for purpose that had driven him to build his company from a single second-hand truck. By the time Josephine was 16, she was doing more than watching. She was restructuring delivery schedules on weekends, cutting fuel costs, and pointing out inefficiencies that veteran managers had missed for years. Marcus's company, Whitfield Logistics, began growing faster than it ever had, and though he never said it aloud, he knew a significant part of that growth traced back to a girl who had once believed she wasn't worth feeding. But the adoption itself was its own battle. Josephine's biological father resurfaced twice during those years, not out of love, but because a story had circulated that Marcus Whitfield was becoming a man of some means, and there might be money to extract from a custody dispute. Marcus fought both attempts in family court, spending money he didn't have on lawyers, missing sleep, missing meals, terrified that the girl he had come to think of as his daughter in every way that mattered would be ripped away and handed back to the very darkness he'd pulled her out of. The final adoption hearing took place when Josephine was 14, in a small county courtroom with peeling paint and a judge who had seen 1,000 cases but still teared up slightly when Josephine, asked if she wanted this adoption to go through, said yes with more certainty than she had said anything in the 2 years Marcus had known her. That certificate, the one she would hold up 15 years later in a very different courtroom, was signed that afternoon, and Marcus kept a framed copy of it in his office for the rest of his life, a daily reminder of the day his family became whole. Josephine went on to excel in ways that stunned everyone who had known her only as the frightened girl behind the dumpster. She graduated high school 2 years early, went on scholarship to study business and finance, and returned to Millhaven not because she had to, but because she wanted to build alongside the men who had built her a home. She rose through Whitfield Logistics with a work ethic that unsettled some of the older executives, not because she demanded respect, but because she earned it quietly, meeting after meeting, decision after decision. By the time she was 25, she was chief financial officer, and the company Marcus had started with 12 trucks now operated a fleet of over 400 vehicles and warehouses in 9 states. It was success on the scale that eventually made Whitfield Logistics a target. Desmond Cole, the same business partner who had once warned Marcus against taking in a troubled child, had over the years grown resentful of the direction the company had taken. He felt sidelined by Josephine's rapid rise, threatened by her sharp mind, and increasingly convinced that Marcus favored his adopted daughter over the partner who had been there since the beginning. What Desmond never said aloud, but what festered in him for years, was a simpler and uglier truth. He wanted more control, more money, and more credit than the fair, transparent structure of the company allowed him. So he began, quietly, methodically, over the course of nearly 2 years, funneling falsified shipping manifests and inflated invoices through a shell logistics broker he secretly controlled, siphoning company funds into accounts that led back, through a careful maze of paperwork, to himself. When federal auditors eventually noticed irregularities in Whitfield Logistics' financial filings, the trail of manipulated documents had been constructed with such care that it appeared, on its surface, to implicate not Desmond, but Marcus. Desmond had been careful. He had used Marcus's digital signature stamp, obtained during a period when Marcus had trusted him enough to leave signing authority unattended. He had timed the fraudulent transactions to coincide with periods when Marcus was traveling and unable to easily account for his whereabouts. And when investigators came calling, Desmond was the first to express shock and sorrow, the loyal business partner devastated to learn that the men he'd built an empire with had apparently been stealing from his own company and its shareholders for years. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning, in front of the Whitfield Logistics headquarters, in front of employees who had known Marcus for 15 years, in front of cameras that had been tipped off in advance by someone who wanted the humiliation to be public. Marcus Whitfield, the man who built an empire from nothing and who had once knelt in the mud beside a dumpster to save a stranger's daughter, was led away in handcuffs on charges of securities fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying federal shipping and tax records. The charges, if proven, carried a sentence of up to 25 years. Josephine remembers standing on the sidewalk that morning, unable to move, watching the only father she had ever truly known being folded into the back of an unmarked car while reporters shouted questions neither of them could answer. She remembers the particular, suffocating silence of the following weeks, when board members who had once fought to shake Marcus's hand at industry dinners now wouldn't return her calls. She remembers Desmond Cole, in board meetings during Marcus's suspension, speaking with practiced sorrow about how painful it was to watch a friend fall, all while quietly maneuvering to have himself named interim CEO, all while quietly working with the company's outside counsel, a slick, ambitious attorney named Preston Holloway, to ensure that any internal investigation stayed pointed firmly away from himself. For the first few weeks after the arrest, Josephine did what the lawyers told her to do. She stayed composed. She let the court-appointed defense attorney handle the discovery process. She trusted, the way she had been taught to trust by 15 years in the Whitfield household, that truth eventually surfaces if you're patient enough to wait for it. But as the trial date approached, and as the prosecution's case grew more damning with every falsified document Desmond's people had planted, Josephine began to understand a bitter truth: patience alone was not going to save her father. Someone was going to have to actively dig up what had been so carefully buried. She did not sleep more than 4 hours a night for nearly 2 months. She combed through internal servers she still had legitimate access to as CFO, cross-referencing invoice numbers against actual delivery logs, comparing digital signature timestamps against Marcus's verified travel records, hunting for the seams in a fraud that had been constructed to look seamless. She hired, using her own personal savings rather than company funds that Desmond now effectively controlled, a forensic accountant named Priya Anand, who had a reputation for finding exactly the kind of digital fingerprints that dishonest men believed they had erased. Together, working out of Josephine's apartment because she no longer trusted the security of her own office, they built a counter-narrative, thread by painful thread. What they found, buried in metadata that Desmond's people had overlooked, was that the shell broker company receiving the fraudulent payments had been registered using an address that traced back, through 2 additional shell companies, to a property owned by Desmond Cole's brother-in-law. They found that several of the falsified invoices had been generated using a printer whose maintenance logs placed it inside Desmond's private office suite, not the general accounting floor where Marcus worked. They found login timestamps showing that Marcus's digital signature had been used to authorize transactions during a week when airline records confirmed Marcus was in Denver at an industry conference, physically incapable of being at his desk at the times in question. But knowing the truth and proving it in a courtroom against a prosecution that had already built momentum, against a company board that had already begun quietly discussing which of Marcus's assets might be seized in restitution, against a former partner who had spent 2 years constructing his lies with patience and precision, that was an entirely different battle. Josephine's own lawyer, an overworked man named Gerald Finch, who was managing a dozen cases at once, advised her repeatedly that the evidence she and Priya had gathered, while compelling, might not be introduced properly if it wasn't filed through the correct channels before the trial's evidentiary deadline, a deadline that was now only days away. It was in those final desperate days that Josephine made a decision that would define the rest of her life, one that echoed, in its own way, the decision Marcus had made 15 years earlier when he chose to stop his car beside a dumpster instead of driving past it. She decided that if the system's slow, careful machinery could not move fast enough to save her father, she would walk directly into the courtroom herself and force the truth into the light, whatever the personal or professional cost. The morning of the verdict hearing, Marcus was brought into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, flanked by 2 sheriff's deputies, looking older and more diminished than Josephine had ever seen him look, even in the earliest days of her own arrival into his life when grief had hollowed him out after his wife's death. Desmond Cole sat in the gallery beside Preston Holloway, dressed in an expensive gray suit, his expression arranged into a careful mask of sympathetic concern, the same mask he had worn in front of cameras for months. The judge had already signaled, through procedural rulings over the previous week, that he considered the prosecution's paper trail strong. Marcus's own attorney had quietly warned Josephine the night before that a guilty verdict was, realistically, the most likely outcome. Josephine stood up in the gallery just as the judge was preparing to move toward closing arguments, and she asked, her voice shaking but audible across the entire courtroom, to be allowed to present newly discovered evidence directly relevant to the authenticity of the documents at the center of the case. The judge, visibly irritated by the interruption, reminded her that the evidentiary period had closed and that this was deeply irregular. But Josephine, dressed not in the tailored boardroom armor she usually wore but in a simple navy blazer she had put on with shaking hands that morning, walked forward anyway, holding in her hands the one piece of leverage she knew no one in that room could ignore, proof, freshly obtained from a records request Priya had pushed through just 2 days earlier, that directly tied the fraudulent shell company to Desmond Cole's family, alongside a personal photograph from years earlier showing Desmond privately coaching a much younger, more naive Marcus on how to set up the very digital signature system that had later been exploited against him, undermining, in a single image, Desmond's repeated courtroom claims that he had never had access to or knowledge of that signature process. The courtroom did not erupt immediately. For a long, suspended moment, there was only silence, the particular silence of powerful people realizing in real time that the ground beneath them has shifted. Then the judge, visibly startled by the specificity and weight of what Josephine was holding, allowed a brief recess to review the documents, over the prosecution's objection, because the material was too directly relevant to due process to be dismissed on a technicality. Desmond Cole's carefully composed expression cracked for the first time in months, and Preston Holloway, his attorney, was seen frantically whispering to him as the judge called for order. What followed over the next several hours, once the recess evidence was formally reviewed and cross-referenced by the court's own forensic examiner, was the slow, agonizing unraveling of nearly 2 years of careful deception. The shell company registration documents were subpoenaed on an emergency basis and confirmed the ownership trail Josephine and Priya had uncovered. The printer maintenance logs were verified against building security records, placing the fraudulent invoice generation squarely inside Desmond's private office during hours when Marcus was verifiably elsewhere. The airline records were cross-checked against the digital signature timestamps, proving beyond reasonable dispute that Marcus could not have physically authorized transactions he was being charged with authorizing. Piece by piece, the case against Marcus Whitfield did not merely weaken, it collapsed, and in its place rose a new and far more damning case against the men who had orchestrated the entire scheme from behind a mask of loyal partnership. Desmond Cole was arrested that same afternoon, led out of the same courthouse in handcuffs while the reporters who had once photographed Marcus's humiliation now turned their cameras toward his. Marcus Whitfield's charges were formally dismissed within the week, the judge noting on the record his serious concerns about the integrity of the original investigation and the apparent orchestration of evidence against an innocent man. Marcus walked out of the courthouse not in an orange jumpsuit but in the same simple gray suit Josephine had brought for him, and the first thing he did, before speaking to a single reporter, before calling a single board member, was to pull his daughter into an embrace so tight and so long that several onlookers, including hardened court officers who had seen every kind of family drama pass through those doors, found themselves quietly wiping their eyes. If this story has touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need to hear a story about loyalty, family, and the truth eventually finding its way to the light. It means more to this channel than you know. In the months that followed, Whitfield Logistics underwent a painful but necessary restructuring. Marcus, at Josephine's urging, stepped back from day-to-day operations, exhausted in a way that money and vindication alone could not fully heal, and Josephine was formally named Chief Executive Officer by a unanimous board vote, a board that had, only months earlier, been quietly preparing to distance itself from the Whitfield name entirely. Under her leadership, the company not only recovered its financial footing but expanded further than it ever had under either Marcus or Desmond, in part because Josephine insisted on a level of transparency and internal auditing that made the kind of fraud Desmond had committed nearly impossible to repeat. But the deeper transformation was not in the company's balance sheets. It was in the relationship between a man who had once knelt in the mud beside a frightened, starving child and the woman that child had become. Marcus, freed from the daily pressures of running an empire, spent his time differently in the years that followed. He became, quietly and without fanfare, an advocate for foster care reform in the very county where he had found Josephine, funding a shelter program specifically designed to intervene faster for children aging out of unstable homes, a program Josephine helped design using the very financial acumen she had first developed sorting his invoices at their kitchen table 2 decades earlier. There is a particular kind of justice that feels almost too poetic to be real, and yet it happened exactly this way. The man who once saved a child from a life on the street was, 15 years later, saved in turn by the very love and character he had spent those years nurturing in her. Marcus often said, in the years after the trial, that he never once regretted stopping his car that rainy November night, even during the darkest weeks of his arrest, because whatever he had given Josephine in that decision, she had given back to him 1,000 times over, culminating in a single, unforgettable moment in a courtroom where she stood up, evidence trembling in her hands, and refused to let the world take away the only father she had ever known. Before we close out this story, I want to ask something small but meaningful from you. If any part of this story reminded you of your own family, your own second chance, or someone who once believed in you when it would have been easier not to, please type the words "family is chosen" in the comments below. It helps us understand how deeply these stories are reaching people, and it means the absolute world to this small channel trying to tell stories worth telling. Marcus Whitfield passed away many years later, not in a courtroom and not in scandal, but peacefully, in his own home, with Josephine at his side, the same way she had been at his side through handcuffs and hearings and the slow rebuilding of an empire that had nearly been stolen from him twice, once by greed, and almost, in the earliest days, by a world that had almost let a shivering child freeze behind a gas station dumpster. At his funeral, Josephine did not speak about business achievements or corporate milestones. She spoke about a man who once knelt in the mud in his work clothes and asked a frightened stranger her name, and she said that everything she had ever built, every fraud she had ever uncovered, every boardroom she had ever commanded, existed only because one ordinary man decided, on one ordinary rainy night, that a stranger's child was worth stopping for. If this story moved you even a little, please don't scroll past without hitting that like button, leaving a comment about what part touched you most, sharing it with someone in your life who needs a reminder that love given freely always finds its way back home, and subscribing to Oxley Stories so you never miss the next story about family, resilience, and the quiet, powerful ways that kindness rewrites the future. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.